Welcome back to the third video in this tutorial series. Now that we've established the basics of early to mid-game, we're going to go into a less action-packed aspect, the CERC side of diplomacy and civilian management. I'm playing on the most up-to-date version, but as always, by the time you're watching this video, many of the features we look at may have had major changes, so please keep that in mind. Every area on the map is part of a zone. These zones outline the population in an area, showing you how many civilians are present, how large the infected presence is, and if there are any civilian factions in the zone. You can see zone borders illustrated by these white lines. Inside zones, civilians will attempt to go about their lives as usual. You'll see them walking in the streets and carrying on with life, until they're influenced by outside forces, such as the infection spreading to the zone, or CERC interacting with them. So, let's look at how you can influence and interact with ambient civilians. There's a lot to go over here, but we'll look at one of the main ways you'll be interacting using the Zone Administration Building to create an evacuation center. I've chosen Sabre Harbor to be our evacuation zone. It's a little cramped, but it's got lots of civilians and is located pretty centrally, so any civilians moving from other zones won't have as far to run to get here. First up, we'll place our Zone Admin Building and wait for it to be airlifted in. It requires a little power too, so drop down a generator. The Zone Admin Building serves as your primary way to interact with civilians in a zone, so make sure not to let it get blown up. Once it's arrived, select it, and we can begin construction from its menu. Holding tents are first up. Each one can hold about 20 civilians, so you might need a lot of them, but we're going to leave it at 4 for now. Then set up 1 or 2 holding cells for any infected civilians you find. Now select an engineer and construct an infection detector tower. Then also place a helipad, which will allow you to airlift civilians to safety. After all of these are in place, there's one last step before you can open up the camp and begin evacuations. Select the admin building and press the Civilian Orders button. Here's where we set the procedures for handling any civilians who come to the camp for safety. There are plenty of options here, and you should think about what will work best for your current situation, but here's a quick look at what I usually use. Once this is done, you can set your helipad to evacuation mode, and turn on civilian intake at your admin building. The process is automated, and civilians will begin to pour in. Make sure to keep your camp clear of infected, as so many civilians clustered in one place is a really tempting target for the infected, and even a small outbreak here can quickly become catastrophic. Cutting away, here's a look at a finished evac camp I set up, with plenty of walls, gates, and security to keep the civilians safe, as well as infection detectors at the entrances. Setting up a robust evacuation camp can be one of the main factors that will give you an edge in winning the game. Every civilian evacuated is less biomass for Patient Zero to use against you, and you get a cash bonus as well for every civilian who evacuates successfully. Be careful rushing evacuations without testing though. If you evacuate too many infected civilians, they may overwhelm your carrier's holding capabilities, and possibly even cause a game over. There are a few more options you have to interact with civilians using the admin building. You can set some levels of martial law in a zone. A curfew will send civilians inside at night when the infected are most active, and full martial law will send civilians inside both day and night. These are useful tools for slowing the infection and protecting civilians, but they won't like it if you keep these laws in place for too long, and your zone reputation will begin to drop steadily. Once your zone rep gets too low, you'll lose the ability to use the intake button in the zone, as civilians will no longer trust you enough to come to the evacuation camp. And with an extremely low reputation, you may find civilian rebel groups popping up, launching attacks and raiding your resources. It's important to pay attention to the overall happiness of a zone and maintain good relations with civilians, so you can focus on dealing with the infection. Or, if you want, you can put down any resistance with force, just be careful. Innocent civilian casualties will carry a cash penalty and may drain your resources a lot more than you'd like. Another option you have is if you'd like to evacuate civilians from one zone to another. You can select an admin building, and in the menu, select any other zone where you also have another admin building present. Civilians will then begin to trickle out and make their way towards the zone you've selected. Also to keep an eye out for are civilian factions. As the virus spreads and order begins to break down, you'll find civilians building fortified bases. These groups range in personality from simple scavenger groups, civilian militias, ruthless bandits, or even insane cannibal cults. Engaging in diplomacy when possible is a useful tool that you should keep in mind, as an allied civilian faction can provide various boosts, from assistance fighting the infected, patrols keeping the area safe, and with enough trust, you can even recruit some of their units as an auxiliary force. Two of the main ways to gain trust with most factions is by evacuating civilians to safety, or by simply throwing large amounts of money and supplies at them through the diplomacy menu, which will allow them to expand. Opening the diplomacy menu will show you a basic overview of all encountered factions and how they feel about you. From here, you can open a menu to initiate trades and offer gifts, but some factions cannot be reasoned with. Bandits and cannibals will be extremely difficult to work with and will often not only launch attacks on CERC, but other factions and sometimes even civilians in the streets. In these cases, it's usually more effective to simply eliminate their camps altogether with a well-placed airstrike and a squad of soldiers to clean up afterwards. Well, that's about everything. In the next portion, we'll cover the final parts of a match that you'll need to know, offensive operations to retake infected territory, and collecting DNA in order to work towards your final goal of defeating Patient Zero. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed.